Welcome everyone to the Human Rights Commission's first town hall meeting. This will be the first of several town halls that we will be hosting on a variety of topics that are important to you, and we would love to hear from you as well about what you'd like to learn more about. But first and foremost, I want to thank all of you today for spending the next 2 hours with us discussing what is always an incredibly difficult topic to discuss, and that's race and discrimination, especially here at home in Vermont. The fact that you are here tonight, listening and participating, gives me great hope and encouragement that as Vermonters, we are really in this together, united in the fight for equity and inclusion. I'd like to thank Amanda Garces tonight, our Director of Policy Education and Outreach, for coordinating today's event and providing all of the technology support. And I have sent and will send again a warm virtual embrace to all of our panelists today who have graciously given us their time and expertise. And I am excited to listen to them and learn from them as well. And before I turn it over to our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the Vermont Human Rights Commission and provide some context for tonight's town hall. So for those of you who don't know, the Vermont Human Rights Commission is a state entity that is charged with promoting full civil and human rights in Vermont. We protect people from unlawful discrimination in housing, state government employment, and in places of public accommodations. And places of public accommodations is huge. It means hospitals, it means schools, it means roads and prisons, and essentially any office or space that provides goods or services to the general public. And if you think about it, that means everywhere. So in addition to the investigations and the litigation that we do at the Human Rights Commission, we also provide training to the public and we advance policies on human rights. So during the legislative session, both Amanda and I are very busy trying to advocate for civil rights and support bills that we know will improve the lives of Vermonters, specifically those who are most vulnerable. And at the same time, we are also opposing bills that we know could be potentially harmful. I'd love to answer any questions that you have later today about the work of the Human Rights Commission and how we can best serve you. We are here only to serve you, and we are only as effective as the people who are listening to us and the people who need us. So we are in this together. Before we start, I want to give us a little visual context today for our conversation. And I'm going to ask Amanda to pull up the PowerPoint. The backlash that we're seeing across the country right now, and here in Vermont against Asian Americans during this pandemic, is not entirely new. Early immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities were stigmatized for different pandemics as well. We see that the Irish were blamed for cholera, the Italians for polio. Early Chinese, Japanese, and Mexican immigrants were deemed the source of smallpox in the United States. African Americans and Jews were supposedly the cause of tuberculosis. And even more recently, immigration policies stigmatized Africans with the Ebola virus, and our country similarly turned against Mexicans and other Latinos for the H1N1 flu. As public officials, we have a responsibility to get it right and to be careful and thoughtful with our language so that we don't create fear and hate. Here we see our president referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. News outlets like the New York Times and the New York Post utilize pictures of Asian Americans wearing masks in a story about the first coronavirus case involving a woman who had traveled to Iran. We didn't know what her race or ethnicity was. The University of California, Berkeley issued a COVID-19 guideline called Common Reactions and identifies xenophobia as a common reaction to the virus. The next series of photos show us how fear has manifested itself in our community. This is a photo of Jonathan Walk, a student who was beaten for being Asian. The perpetrators yelled, "I don't want your coronavirus in my country." Jonathan gave us permission to share his story and photographs with you today. At a Sam's Club, a family with 2 children as small as 2 and 6 were stabbed because the perpetrator thought that they were Chinese people infecting people with the coronavirus. Here's another example. Places of public accommodations are denying people services based on race and national origin. We see neighbor-on-neighbor harassment. We also know that people of color, and specifically African Americans, are dying in greater numbers than any other group. And here are some statistics. And the question that we have to ask ourselves and each other is, why is this happening? Is it possible that we are prioritizing the privileged over others in our health services? As we process these images and headlines that are incredibly disturbing, I'd like to turn it over to Paul, who is our moderator today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to take a quick moment on National Nurses Day, just acknowledge all of the healthcare employees and those that support them, that are doing everything that they can to keep so many people, not only across our country, but across the world, healthy and safe. There are many things that they've been asked to do that really truly go above and beyond what they might normally be asked to do. And again, we just wanted to make sure that on National Nurses Day, that we take a moment to acknowledge all of their hard work, their sacrifice, and the things that their families and loved ones are doing to support them through this as well. So welcome again, everyone. My name is Paul Seokhyun Yoon. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I have the privilege of serving as Senior Advisor to the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Vermont. In addition, I'm a small business owner here. I'm a co-partner in a small consultancy called CQ Strategies that provides training and consulting services in these areas to organizations all across our great state and in other parts of the region as well. A little fun fact that I wanted to share with all of you about myself is that I play a cool card game called Magic the Gathering that I used to play as a middle schooler and that I continue to play now as an adult. And it's really helped me to keep my mind off of some things and connect with some of my friends through that game. So little fun fact about myself there. So I have the privilege of just asking our panelists to introduce themselves. And so each one of them will come up in just a moment here and introduce themselves to you. Just to foreshadow a little bit as well, we have some questions that we are asking each of our panelists to answer. Each of those panelists is going to have a few minutes to answer that particular question. And as some of you have already seen, we are going to have some questions that come in from you, our audience, that we would love to get to and answer as well. And so we'll try to do as many of those questions as we possibly can. All right. So first up, I'll just ask Susanna to introduce yourself, please.
Buenas tardes, everybody. My name is Susanna Davis. I'm the Executive Director of Racial Equity for the state of Vermont. This is a role that was created by an act of the legislature in 2018, signed into law by the governor in 2018. And I was officially appointed, or rather I began officially at the very end of July of last year. So it's been about 9 months or so here in this role. It is a new role to the state, and alongside my role is also the Racial Equity Advisory Panel, which was created to serve in an advisory capacity to the person in my role. And actually Judge Waples, who's also on this panel, is a member of that panel as well. I use she series pronouns, and I don't have an interesting fact because I'm not an interesting person, but I suppose one thing I could share is that I enjoy making things, which includes making handmade soaps, knitting and crocheting, and tinkering with furniture and other items to revive and restore them.
Thank you, Susanna. Next, we're going to have Judge Nancy Waples introduce herself.
All right, and thank you, Paul. My name is Nancy Waples, and I am a Vermont Superior Court judge. I am a judge that is appointed, who sits on the trial bench. I am currently the presiding judge in Lamoille County. Prior to my appointment to the bench, I practiced law as a criminal defense attorney in the state and federal courts of Vermont. Prior to going into private practice as a criminal defense attorney, I served as a federal prosecutor in this district, in the District of Vermont. And prior to that, I was an assistant district attorney in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So my background is largely in criminal law, but as a judge on the Superior Court bench, we have general jurisdiction. I preside on all cases that come before the court, and that is criminal cases, family cases, civil court cases, and of course our juvenile docket. In terms of any, I'm not so sure it's a fun fact, but an interesting fact is I'm very proud to be the first and only minority appointed to the bench in the state of Vermont on the trial bench. I hope I am not the last, but I look forward to encouraging more people of color to apply to the bench because it is a wonderful job to serve the citizens of the state.
Thank you so much, Judge Waples. And that is, I think, truly an amazing thing that you were the first and only at the moment as well. And as you said, hopefully not last. We have another panelist, Tabitha Pull-Moore. At the moment, unfortunately, we're not able to get her video up, but we are going to have her try to introduce herself by phone call to all of you. All right. So hold on one moment with us, please.
Yes.
Oh, yes. All right. 1 out of 2 isn't bad. As long as you can hear me, it doesn't matter if you can see me. I'll go ahead and describe that I'm in full makeup and hair, and I look fantastic, and I'm not sitting in a sweatshirt on my couch. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Tabitha Moore. I'm here tonight in my role as president of the Rutland area branch of the NAACP. In addition to that, I work for UVM as a training specialist for the Child Welfare Training Partnership. My background is in understanding how systems promote or prohibit positive identity development. So I'm currently working in child welfare. I served in law enforcement in New York as a probation officer and was the first woman of color promoted to the position of administrator before coming back to my roots here in Vermont to work as a school counselor. And I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist. And I guess something interesting about me, I coach high school cheerleading, and my team just won their 4th straight title. Go Minutemen. That's me.
Thank you so much, Tabitha, and congratulations to that team as well.
Thank you.
So we have, again, a few questions that we prepared that we wanted our panelists to answer and to talk through. After, again, those questions, we'll try to get through as many of the audience generated questions as well. So the first question that we have is for you, Judge Waples. And that question is, what are hate crimes? What is hate speech? And what is the legal definition of bias incidents? If you could please help us understand that, we would greatly appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Paul. I'll provide a brief overview of law in Vermont addressing hate crimes motivated by racial bias. Vermont does not criminalize behavior or speech motivated by bias as a separate offense, independent of the commission of a predicate offense. Instead, the law provides a penalty enhancement and civil rights of action when a crime was motivated by racial or other specified biases. There are two exceptions. Racially motivated behavior may also fall under the disorderly conduct statute as threatening behavior. And that statute in Vermont is Title 13, Section 1026. Certain speech in narrow context could potentially be prosecuted as fighting words as well. And that is under the criminal threatening statute in Vermont, which is, again, Title 13, Section 1702. I'll discuss the three areas separately. As to the first category, for penalty enhancement, under Vermont law, the maximum penalty for both misdemeanor and felony offenses can be enhanced, that is, increased, if the person who, and this is a quote from the statute, who commits, causes to be committed, or attempts to commit any crime was maliciously motivated by the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, national origin, sex, ancestry, age, service in the U.S. Armed Forces, disability, sexual orientation, or gender identity. The amount that a penalty can be enhanced differs depending on the maximum penalty for the underlying crime. And the Vermont Supreme Court upheld this statute when it was passed by the legislature following a U.S. Supreme Court precedent holding that penalty enhancement statutes based on motivation of race or other specified biases are not overbroad and do not create a chilling effect on one's First Amendment constitutional rights. So though Vermont statutes do not otherwise create independent hate crime offenses, it does make it a felony, however, to intentionally and maliciously burn a cross or a religious symbol. There is a civil right of action allowing a person harmed by conduct under the penalty enhancement statutes to request injunctive relief, that the conduct stop, damages, and attorney fees. So the two categories of the Vermont statutes that does recognize a racially motivated crime are under, as I stated earlier, the disorderly conduct statute and the criminal threatening statute. So as to the disorderly conduct statute, which is Title 13 of the Vermont statute, Section 1026, a person violates this prong of the disorderly conduct statute by engaging in fighting or in violent, tumultuous, or threatening behavior. The Vermont Supreme Court recently defined the scope of this provision in a case called State v. Shank. There have not been many cases that have gone up to the Vermont Supreme Court on appeal on these offenses. And in Shank, the Supreme Court held that the disorderly conduct statute does not apply to threatening speech, but only to conduct. And while speech can be introduced to explain or provide context for physical conduct, the court held that this provision only criminalized the use of physical force or physical conduct, which is immediately likely to produce the use of force. I'm going to just move my notes for a minute. So in the Shank case, and it's just interesting just to talk a bit about the facts in this case, In that case, the trial court denied the defendant's motion to dismiss 2 disorderly conduct charges after the defendant distributed Ku Klux Klan recruitment flyers tucked into the front door and in the mailbox of a Mexican-American woman and an African-American woman. In denying the motion to dismiss, the court looked at several factors. The court looked, and this is at the trial court level, the trial court looked particularly at how the defendant entered the curtilage, that is the yard. That's an area of heightened expectation of privacy of each of these women's homes, the ethnicity of the women, and found that the content of the flyers, which included the Klan name, symbols, and an image of a burning cross, implied impending harm. The Vermont Supreme Court reversed the trial court's denial of the motion to dismiss, holding instead that the state did not establish a prima facie case, meaning a case on its face, because the defendant's conduct conveyed neither the physical nor the imminent threat of harm required to establish threatening behavior under the statute. The court found that leaving flyers at the home of these women constituted speech and not non-speech behavior, because the act of entering the curtilage and placing the flyers in the mailbox and the front door was just the method of delivering the alleged threatening speech. The method of delivery was not just incidental to the speech contained in the flyers, so could not amount to enough to meet the physical requirement, the use of force. The court also found that the content of the flyers did not convey an imminent threat of harm because it was just a message of recruitment and not an immediate threat. To the extent it conveys a message of personal threat to the recipient, it is that the Klan will recruit members and then will inflict harm in the future. In holding that this provision of the disorderly conduct statute only criminalizes conduct that is not speech, the Vermont Supreme Court excludes even speech that is not protected by the First Amendment from being prosecuted under the statute. So while the disorderly conduct statute has a narrowly defined application to fighting words, challenges to other unprotected speech, such as true threats, cannot be brought under that statute. And the Shank decision defines true threats as statements where the speaker means to communicate a serious expression of an intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular individual or group of individuals. These statements can be regulated because they are not protected by the First Amendment. It's a little bit of tortured reasoning, but they do address that there are other statutes that can criminalize threatening language. And that I'll explain that when I talk about the criminal threatening statute. But as to the disorderly conduct statute, certain speech may still fall under fighting words exception to the First Amendment protection. Speech can only amount to a violation of the disorderly conduct disorderly conduct statute if it is appropriately inflammatory. So what is appropriately inflammatory? The use of foul language and vulgar insults is insufficient. A likelihood of rousing animosity or inflaming anger is insufficient. The likelihood that the listener will feel an impulse to respond angrily or even forcefully is insufficient. The provision only reaches speech that, in the context in which it is uttered, is so inflammatory that it is akin to dropping a match into a pool of gasoline. And that's a direct quote from another case that went up on appeal in disorderly conduct and the use of language as a crime under the disorderly conduct statute. So where does that leave where does that leave the state of the law in terms of criminalizing speech? Again, always, the courts are always mindful of the constitutional protections of the First Amendment, and the Vermont statute regarding regarding criminal threatening applies specifically to speech. It prohibits a person from threatening another person, and as a result of that threat, placing the other person in reasonable apprehension of death or serious bodily injury. And that statute is, again, Title 13 of the Vermont statute, Section 1702. Section 1702 specifically addresses threatening speech and acknowledges that such a crime can extend only as far as the First Amendment allows. The presence, however, of that statute is an indication that threatening behavior, as criminalized in the disorderly conduct statute, should not extend to threatening speech. It has to be, the interpretations of the Supreme Court so far is that it has to be accompanied or at least progress to some physical contact. The Vermont Supreme Court in the Schenck case also noted that because the criminal threatening statute refers solely to threats and not to any threatening behavior, the Vermont legislature saw fit to expressly limit the application of the statute to stay within the confines of the First Amendment. It is reasonable to conclude that the criminal threatening statutes reference to threats is meant to address those conveyed through speech without accompanying any physical conduct. So that's the current state of the statutes that address the racial bias or racially motivated criminal conduct. Most of the cases are, most of the conduct is addressed at the sentencing phase through the enhancement penalties that I've seen. I presided over 2 cases where the charges were under the disorderly conduct statute, but unfortunately those cases involved physical conduct in addition to the language. So that's all I have right now, Paul, in terms of the state of the law in Vermont regarding these issues.
Judge Waples, we had a couple of questions that came in right now
Okay.
that we were hoping that you might be able to answer just because they build directly off of what it is that you were talking about.
All right.
So the first question, okay. The first question was just around, is it a possibility for Vermont laws about threatening speech to be quote unquote strengthened?
Yeah, the legislators. It's the legislature. You know, we're a 3-branch government, and you know, my role is to give full force and effect to the laws that are passed by the legislature. The prosecuting of those offenses is up to the executive branch, and of course that is the governor, the law enforcement officers. So certainly they can be strengthened by contacting your local legislator regarding your concerns if you feel that the law is not strong enough.
And just another question related to what you were talking about. Could you please repeat the name for the exception on speech that you had just quoted a few minutes ago?
You mean the case name or the criminal threatening statute? So there,
I believe so.
Yeah. So the criminal threatening statute is Title 13 of the Vermont statutes, and it is Section 1702 of that statute.
And we will try to find a link to that as well, and try to share that with people if they're interested in seeing the actual statute.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Judge. We really appreciate your insight here. The next question that we have is going to be for Susanna Davis, and I'm just going to put her up here to get us going. And Susanna, I think what people were really interested in knowing about as well is what the current data is telling us and what other data we might need in order to make more equity-minded decisions about outcomes here in the state. So if you could help us by talking about that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually have a few slides. I don't know if we're able to pull those up. If not, I'll paint you all a word picture. But I specifically want to talk about data with respect to COVID-19, which I think is probably a good place to focus right now. So first, I just want to make sure that attendees are aware that they can check daily the updated information about COVID-19 cases in the state of Vermont. The way that they do that is by going to the Vermont Health Department's website. That website is healthvermont.gov. And when you land at healthvermont.gov, you will see, right now you will see a big banner that says, one of the things that it says is current activity in Vermont for COVID-19. Great. And then on our next page, you'll see where you land when you click that large banner in the center. Great. And then on our next page, you'll see where you land when you click that large banner in the center. And the reason that I'm walking you all through these steps is because the health department website, particularly this COVID-19 dashboard, has a lot of information on it. And we have been told that it's difficult to know how to navigate it to find certain information, specifically data disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So what you'll see at the bottom of this screenshot is that at the very bottom, you'll see something that says click to view tabs or something like that. You'll see two left and right arrows, and that's what you would click to scroll through the dashboard. So let's talk about the actual numbers on the dashboard. Today's numbers on our next slide will show that we have a total of 908 positive cases of COVID-19 in the state of Vermont. That's 908 cases since we began tracking, and that is, again, through yesterday. So this is current information. Of those 908 positive cases, there have been 52 deaths in Vermont. Now, those are people who don't necessarily, I mean, most of them are people who live in Vermont. Some of them do not. They're in Vermont, and we are counting them in our state's death count. And the same thing with positive cases. But what I think you all are here for is to see this data disaggregated by race and to understand what impact it's having on communities of color in Vermont. So our next slide will show COVID-19 positive cases by ethnicity and by race. And the first thing I'm going to do is pause here to explain what we mean by ethnicity and race. So the information that's being collected regarding patient demographic data and other information in COVID-19 cases is being collected at the provider level. That means if a person is symptomatic and goes to a healthcare provider and says, hey, I think I might be symptomatic of COVID-19. When we do the screening examination and the provider fills out a form, that is a form that's created by the CDC, that's the US Centers for Disease Control. And that form specifically has a box that says patient ethnicity, and then a separate box that says patient race. And you can check multiple boxes in each of those sections. Ethnicity, the categories are limited to Hispanic, non-Hispanic, or unknown. And then the categories for race include Black, white, Asian, American Indian or Alaska Native, and other with a line for you to specify. So when we look again at the Vermont data that show COVID-19 positive cases by ethnicity and by race, that information is coming from the CDC form that all providers nationally are required to use in these screenings. So what do our data say? As of yesterday, positive cases of COVID-19, 97% of them were non-Hispanic. 2.5% of them were listed as Hispanic. Regarding race, 94% of them were listed as white. And you'll see the breakdown of other ethnic groups. For those who are on the phone or for those who cannot read this very small print, I will list them out for you. American Indian and Alaska Native was 0.12% of the state's positive COVID-19 cases. Asian, 1.19%. Black or African American, 2.26%. And quote, other race, 2.14% of positive COVID-19 cases by race. Our next slide will show COVID-19 deaths by race and ethnicity in Vermont. So what we just looked at was positive cases. Now we'll look specifically at deaths. And so what we will see is that by ethnicity, 97.96% of COVID-19 deaths in Vermont were listed as non-Hispanic. And 2.04% were listed as Hispanic. Deaths by race, you'll notice that we have a much narrower breakdown. And I'll get back to that in a moment. 86.5% of COVID-19 deaths in the state of Vermont were listed as patients who were white. 3.85% of COVID-19 deaths were listed as patients who were Asian. And quote, other race was 9.62%. Now, what on earth does that mean? Does that mean there's disparity, or does that mean that there is not disparity? Based on best estimates of numbers from 2015 and that we've accumulated since then, the non-white population in Vermont is roughly 6%. And that breaks down to about the following. Latino, 1.7%, Asian, 1.4%. I think it's closer to 1.6 now. Black or African American, 1.1% of the state population. American Indian or Alaska Native, 0.3%. And mixed race, 1.9% of the state population. All of those total about 6%, leaving 94% of Vermonters as identifying as white. So, based on today's COVID numbers, the non-white population of the state is 6%. The non-white COVID positive cases are 6%. But the deaths by COVID among non-white people in Vermont is 14%. Now, we know again that 3.85% of that is Asian people in Vermont who have died of COVID. However, the rest of everyone else who's not white was lumped into other race, and that's a whopping 9.62%, almost 1 in 10 people is not white, not Asian, and we don't have a breakdown of who they are. And that leads me to the next point that I'd like to make. You'll see on our next slide some of the limitations of these data. So number one, this is a big one. The difference between self-reported data and perceived data. You'll notice that as I was describing the patients, I kept saying they were listed as white or listed as American Indian. And that was because even though we have a tidy form given to us by the CDC that providers fill out, often with the patient present, it is often the case that providers are assuming a person's race or ethnicity based on their assessment of who that person is or what that person is. That means that oftentimes they're not asking the patient their race or ethnicity. They're assuming it and then putting it down on paper as such. Now, I always use myself as an example. If we were to do this just on site, I would be miscategorized almost every time because phenotypically, people don't assume that I am Latina, which means that there are certain screenings that maybe I should be recommended for that I'm not recommended for. Or there are certain screenings that are perhaps more common for the African American community that I might be recommended for that aren't necessarily priority for me. So Increasingly, additionally, we have a mixed race population in Vermont that is projected to grow by more than 200% by 2050, which means it's going to be increasingly difficult for us to be able to guess accurately a person's race or ethnicity, especially if a person is multiracial. So being able to afford people the opportunity to speak on their own behalf and self-report, self-identify is really key. And I know we have other members on the panel who have shared different thoughts about that, which are completely valid as well. I mean, after all, we have to acknowledge the fact that race and ethnicity has often been used as a weapon to harm people in our country, and it's been used against them in many cases. So it is difficult to be able to collect that information accurately when trust has really been deteriorated in a historical context. That said, this is one of the limitations of the data that we've just looked at, the fact that a lot of the race and ethnicity is perceived and not self-reported. Second, what these data don't tell us is a holistic view of the patient situation. It's one thing for patient A to be COVID positive and perhaps to live in a household where self-isolation is possible, to have the sort of job that permits him or her to work from home, to have the sort of community and family supports that allows that person to remain in quarantine or to have supports in other ways in their life. It doesn't tell us how patient A will fare compared to patient B, who may not have those other supports and who may not have the full picture that allows them to weather the storm that COVID might wreak in their lives. Another limitation of the data is that there are privacy and safety concerns that restrict our ability to get very granular with those numbers. For example, you remember the category of other race, where we had a lot of people lumped into it. Oftentimes, when we get to reporting numbers of smaller and smaller subsects, it gets more difficult when it comes to race in Vermont because, and this is something that we hear very often from people who don't want to share data, we often hear them say, well, the population is so small, it could identify people at the individual level. And that's an absolutely valid concern. One, because federal law prohibits us from giving identifiable information. So even if we wanted to, oftentimes federal law bars us and state law bars us from doing so. But second, there are also safety concerns. Someone like me who does not identify as white, and you can pretty much see it by looking at me, it's very difficult for me to be seen in the world and not be seen as a person of color. Similarly, we see with COVID-19 a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, not just here, but around the country. So when we're reporting numbers about people who may or may not be COVID-19 positive, with such small populations, it really does pose a risk that people exhibiting xenophobic behavior might target those, saying, oh, you must be the one person in the town of X who's positive, because you're the only person of color in the town of X. So that's another limitation of being able to report these data at a granular level. And last, these data don't tell us who's being tested at all. They don't tell us who's being denied tests, which is a huge, huge thing that we see across the medical industry. People of color are statistically less likely to be offered screenings and other preventative health services. So who's being denied COVID tests in the first place is a measure that we don't have. And it's very difficult to collect because it would require providers to account for every person they turn away who comes in seeking a COVID test, or who comes in who's symptomatic, who maybe they should be offering a test to, but they don't. The other thing is who has access to healthcare, right? I mean, we could track the 908 people who've been tested positive, but then what? We don't know what their access to care looks like, and we don't know what other comorbidities or other aggravating underlying conditions they may have that exacerbates their condition. And last, one thing that these data can't tell us is the impact that a positive diagnosis is going to have on the person's life or community. For example, if I test positive for COVID-19, I am privileged to have the sort of job that allows me to keep working even through my illness, which mitigates things like wage loss or disruption of my ability to pay for my housing and food and other necessities. So the holistic picture, the full impact of how a person's life is going to be impacted is something that we can't get through these numbers. And that's one of the reasons that it's so important that we, not only as a state, but that we with our community partners, et cetera, keep a close ear to the ground and understand what's happening. I've had conversations with folks in the public safety department who have shared that there have been anti-Asian crimes committed with reference to COVID-19, things like vandalism, harassment, verbal threats, et cetera. And oftentimes we hear about these cases secondhand through other people who are not the victims, because people don't always come forward. So it's really important that we remain connected to communities and connected to people, because we're not going to understand the full picture unless we're present in every space where these disparities manifest.
All right, Susanna, thank you so much. There are a few questions that, again, I think are pertinent to what you just shared that I think might be best answered or tried to be answered right now. And so the first one was just, have you worked with Commissioner Levine at all? And can you tell us if we can expect to see the state release testing cases and death count data by race and ethnicity at either the county or city level?
I have worked with Dr. Levine, and I have to say, before I respond to the question, I have to say that since I came to Vermont, I have been impressed with the health department's grasp and enthusiasm around health equity. They have been consistent in raising up issues of public health that disproportionately affect Vermonters of color. And so I have enjoyed working with them on public health issues. And when the issue came up with COVID-19 reporting, I don't know how many of you had been tracking this, but early on in our reporting, we had not been tracking race or ethnicity very well, and we were not publicly reporting it at all. In the last few weeks, we have really stepped up. We've gone back and collected missing race and ethnicity data, and we have done a better job of reporting it publicly, as you can see from the dashboards. But we still have a ways to go, right? We're still lumping deaths of a lot of ethnic groups as other race. So yes, I have worked with Dr. Levine on the availability of data and the collection of data, and we have more to do. But so far, I think the agency has been very, very helpful in getting questions answered. And the second part of that question was, Paul, refresh me.
Yes, absolutely. Just basically, are we going to be able to see these numbers by race and ethnicity at the county or city level?
Okay, so that's where it gets trickier. And the short answer is yes, I think. County level, I think, is mostly doable. Places like Chittenden County that have larger populations, it's much easier to do. Places, and I'm discovering all kinds of places in Vermont. For example, having this conversation, I recently learned that we have a town called Victory that has 87 people in it. So when we talk about things at the town level, that's when you get into identifiable information. And so we have to do a delicate dance around federal and state privacy laws. So the answer is that I and the health department have committed to saying that if we're allowed to share it, we're going to share it. And it's really just a matter of doing it quickly, doing it accurately, and making sure that we're not running up against privacy issues.
I think I can certainly understand that as well, especially as you just said, when we're talking about very, very small ends in certain cases, in certain places throughout our state here. The other question that I think was kind of relevant to what you were just talking about was a person participating asking whether the refugee population with disabilities are included in some way in these numbers. Do you have any idea how many refugees with disabilities might be impacted with COVID-19 in Vermont?
That's an excellent question, because now we're getting into intersectionality. And that's why, again, it's really important to have that multi-sectoral approach. part of the conversations that I've been having with VDH include NAACP, include migrant advocates, and also include advocates for Vermonters living with disabilities. So the race and ethnicity data that are on the website are collected irrespective of a person's immigration status. So if a person who is a resettled refugee in Vermont is testing positive for COVID-19 or is dying of COVID-19, yes, that information is tracked. Now, we do not yet have the data disaggregated by presence of a disability. I don't know if that information is collected and just not reported, or if we're not, or if it's not being collected at all. And that is part of the ongoing conversations that we're having at the state level, is making sure that we're including all of the marginalized and vulnerable populations. So the short answer is I am not aware of those figures. I know that race and ethnicity is being tracked, but disability I'm not sure the status of that information being tracked, and I don't know whether the intersectional points are being linked.
Thank you. And again, I think that it's great that the data is there now, that at least some of it is. And I hear that there has been some efforts to try to figure out other ways to provide more data in that regard, to really understand the impact COVID-19 is having on different populations. I do see that there have been some other questions that have come in regarding some of the things that Susanna was just talking about. We hope that we've answered as many of those as possible. And we are trying our best as well in chat to try to answer some questions that might not pertain directly to a specific panelist, but to another, again, question or another entity as well. So next, oh yes, please, absolutely.
I do just want to add, for those who have more questions or who want a deeper dive on this, the state legislature has been holding its hearings virtually and has been live streaming them on YouTube and leaving them posted on YouTube. So for those of you who'd like more information and backstory on how these conversations have unfolded, please do find the Senate and House committees hearings on YouTube. Go back and watch those, and then you can get much more detail than we're able to provide tonight. But a lot of the answers to your questions, I think, are buried in those.
Thank you again, Susanna. So we're going to shift here to our next panelist. Tabitha is going to be our next panelist, and we're going to try to get at least a picture of her up here for all of you, so that you can see her face as she is talking. Thank you again, Susanna. So we're going to shift here to our next panelist. Tabitha is going to be our next panelist, and we're going to try to get at least a picture of her up here for all of you, so that you can see her face as she is talking. But our question for you, and this is actually, I think, a great segue here, is, and actually I'll put my kind of camera up here, at least for the time being, while I'm speaking. The question that we wanted to ask you, and that I think is going to be really helpful for people who are on this to hear about, is what is happening in our communities? What stories have you heard that have come through the NAACP? What has been our community response, either in Rutland or in other parts of the state as well? So if you could talk a little bit about that, I'm sure people are really eager to hear, again, what is actually happening here on the ground.
We at the NAACP have been dealing with issues related to discrimination toward people of color, not just here in the Rutland area, but across Vermont. I think both Susanna and Bor alluded to some of that. So a lot of it, as much hate is driven by fear. And so I wanted to start by providing you with an example of what we see here in Rutland County, some of the stuff that we're seeing here. And then I saw that somebody had a question that actually is very much related to another complaint that we fielded, and I want to make sure to address how the community has been dealing with that so people have a sense of what they can do when this sort of thing happens. So Amanda, would you mind sharing the post that I sent along to you? This was something that I was alerted to shortly after we went into the stay at home, stay safe order. There was a person in Rutland County who was in Rutland City at Walmart who took it upon themselves to record people of color with New York plates who were in the parking lot at Walmart. I'm going to show you a video that accompanies this. And ended up posting, let me scroll back in here and read the post that accompanied this video. It said, "This is happening in Price Chopper parking lot in Rutland. 2 cars, 3 adults sat at a table between 2 cars. I asked them what they're doing and they told me in a Jamaican accent, they're here to clean up our state because we can't. I told them to clean up New York first, but Hunter Security says they are controlling it. No cops happened to no cops. What happened to social distancing? They're 2 feet from each other, WTF." Which if you're not familiar, I probably shouldn't be saying. So Amanda's gonna post a video so that everybody can hear the exchange and how fear and racism oftentimes look similar and can be tricky to tease out.
No, I'm protecting my family. Get out of here. Go back to your infected state. Go back to your infected state. If you're worried about cleaning shit up, clean up New York, where your plates are from. Blow me. Free state, ain't it? You can sit up here. Call them, please call them. I'm 6 feet away. 6 feet away. I want you out of here.
Well, that's not up to you. You're not the president. You're not the governor. Here comes security.
That's good.
Goodbye. Bye.
Yeah, sure. Yep. I'm here taking control of this, all right? So whatever's going on right now, it's going to be dealt with, okay?
Get out.
All right? So there's no need to continue.
I won't say a word.
All right? You all set then?
I'm all set.
All right.
You all set?
I am.
I'm worried about my state.
Right.
Where's the most infected area?
All right. Now look, so now that I let you know that all this is under control, this is private property, all right?
There. Got me now?
Actually,
Go write tickets.
the bushes are right there.
Go write me a ticket then.
That's the end of the property.
Write me a ticket then. This is a bigger problem. Two cars from New York. Yes, the most infected state, New York. Setting up a table. Not sure if they're 6 feet away from each other, but it's close. Got security there, guarding. They do more than just ticket our cars.
But it's an excellent example of how people start with fear and either unconscious bias or straight up racism ends up playing a role. And what happens in this video, as you can see there are two people, they have a table out, it's covered, you can tell exactly who they are. It says Jantronics on their table cover. They were there actually to try to hire people from Rutland to work for them. They were a company that was hired by Rutland Regional Medical Center to help with the potential overflow of COVID-19 patients. This was, like I said, shortly after the stay-at-home order was issued. And they had been hired by us locally to try to help take care of Rutland patients, and they were trying to hire people from Rutland. But the person that created this video did a few things. Number one, in his post, he referred to their Jamaican accents. These people were not Jamaican, they were Latino. And very, very different accents. But when you live here in Vermont and maybe you have a sheltered life and you are think that you're just acting on fear and trying to protect yourself, oftentimes that's when the ugliest parts of humanity are coming out. And that's what we saw in this situation. Had the person who posted the video bothered to even be curious rather than spew anger and hate and tell these people to go home and that they're, you know, potentially infecting people from our area, and if you notice they were wearing masks, he would have found out that they were being safe, that they were doing the best that they could for people in Rutland, and that they were trying to help us to be safe. So that is one of the examples of hate that we had to face here in Rutland County. We did go down and talk to those folks and offer them some support, and they explained that normally they would be at the Department of Labor, but the Department of Labor was closed, so they had talked to the folks at the plaza there in Rutland and got permission to be there. And a number of folks were coming up and applying for jobs. And the way that this actually came to me was that another person in Rutland County saw that the individual posted this video and said, whoa, Tabitha, this is not what we should be doing. This is not how we should be responding during a pandemic. And it's really easy during a pandemic to turn reasonable, rational fear into xenophobic hate. And another example that we're dealing with that actually is very similar to one that somebody posted, Asian American families in our area, particularly business owners, are experiencing some really hateful things. Their children who grew up in our school systems right before the schools were shut down, I think it was like March 16th, somewhere about that schools shut down. A couple of students went into school and they were told it's the Chinese virus, very similar to what our president was calling it, telling them that it's their fault, that they need to go back to China. Mind you, these kids came up through schools in our area. You know, some of them, you know, who knows if they've even ever been to China? Who knows, you know, for some of them, if they're even Chinese. We've had a number of people who are not even Chinese, who are other from other areas, descended from other areas in Asia, who are saying that they're getting told that this is their fault and are having some pretty crude comments directed toward them. So people are trying to interrupt it, but it's really difficult when things are based in fear. You understand that people have fear, but fear cannot supersede the need to be kind and respectful to other folks. So in response to the question, what can we do? One community here locally had a response when a local business was, a local Chinese restaurant was experiencing, what? Did somebody want to say something? No? Okay. So we had a local business that was experiencing discrimination, and the community, again, it was prior to the, you know, complete shutdown. The community rallied around this business and had a day where it was just everybody ordered takeout from the restaurant to show love to the family and let them know that they respected and cared for them. And that was really meaningful, and it was a very healing opportunity. And that was facilitated by the community. It was not by us. It was not by you know, any outside entity. So when you're responding to incidents of hate in your community, one of the best things you can do is just think about what you might want in that situation. Ask the folks what they might need in that situation. Some people, especially if you grew up here, I'm a 6th generation Vermonter, you hear all kinds of crazy things. The number of people that would touch my hair as a child because they'd never seen an afro. At some point, you just learn to deal with it. But for folks, particularly white folks, who maybe this is their first time seeing this sort of harassment happen, and they're surprised by the fact that, you know, here in liberal Vermont, we have hate and that people manifest racism, it can be shocking to you, but it might not be shocking to the individual to whom it's happening. So to respect where that person is coming from, to follow their lead, and to ask open-ended questions can be really helpful in a situation like that. In a situation like the one in the video that you didn't get to see the full clip of, a bystander may have chosen, there were none that were in the immediate area, could have interrupted the gentleman that was videoing and saying, hey, what are you doing? Like, I get that you're scared, right? Validate the fact that, yeah, a pandemic is scary. And right then we had no information. We didn't know what was happening. I get that you're scared, but that's no reason to be racist. That's no reason to target these people because they have New York plates. Hey, how about you be curious? Maybe they're here for, you know, for a reason. They're wearing masks. And try to lean into that and interrupt it at the same time. If they start to escalate, as in the case with the young man that Bohr showed in the video in the opening, when it's starting to escalate into a physical situation, trying to get the victims away if you can and you feel safe and comfortable doing so can be the best thing. And let the person that is ranting rant. Call the police. It was great that Hunter Security in that video was right there and really put himself between the folks that were there from Jantronics and the gentleman that was trying to video them and was harassing them. So I'd say that's pretty much what I have to say about addressing some of the hate that's happening here. I did see another person posted about immigration status. Unfortunately, again, on a national level, the discourse is such that we are denying spouses of immigrants a stimulus check. On what basis? On what grounds? Again, it's this xenophobia that runs rampant under the guise of fear that those of us who are paying attention really need to hone in on and fight back. Fight back against that. So, Amanda, I think that's pretty much what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Tabitha, and thank you for answering that question from the very, very beginning of our event as well. It sounds like what you've just said is for people to be, again, fighting back, so to speak, by either reaching out to their elected representatives or, again, to our national representatives as well to see how we might have those policies changed. So thank you again for those. We wanted to also just spend a few minutes, and I've been asked to just talk a little bit about my own personal experience as an Asian American in Vermont, living with this situation. And we thought that it would be good to humanize this experience a little bit. So thank you again for those. We wanted to also just spend a few minutes, and I've been asked to just talk a little bit about my own personal experience as an Asian American in Vermont, living with this situation. And we thought that it would be good to humanize this experience a little bit. I also wanted to just quickly acknowledge that we understand that most of you were unable to hear the audio from the video, and we apologize. We hope that the explanation that Tabitha provided helped you kind of understand exactly what was going on in that situation. Really, that situation and other situations we've heard about where people have been grocery shopping, for example, and being verbally attacked in the parking lot about being Asian American or something along those lines are all illustrative stories of some of the experiences that people are having. Whether they're Asian American, whether they are, again, people of color in general, again, just kind of living through this really, unbelievably crazy time. So I just wanted to, again, share a little bit about my own personal experience. My wife is a white woman, and we have two young kids, a 5 and a 9-year-old. And throughout this whole situation, it has been an extremely nerve-wracking time for us, like we know it has been for many of you as well. Lots of conversations that we've had that, frankly, we never thought we'd ever have to have, not only with one another as the adults in the home, but in particular with our young kids as well. I remember quite early on in the middle of March, as we were starting to self-quarantine and self-isolate, you know, we really were just wondering at the time how bad things were going to get here in Vermont and elsewhere around the world as well. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to, you know, get to the grocery store to get all of the food items that we might need, or again, if we would be able to interact with my in-laws who live just in Burlington, you know, a little ways from where we are at the moment. So there were a lot of things that we were wondering about, worrying about. And on top of that, we of course were worrying about not only our own health and safety, but also whether we would have jobs to go back to when all of this was done. And if truly our entire kind of society as it is right now would be able to sustain itself through this, just given the extremeness of our shelter-in-place orders. I also vividly remember early on really having some very serious conversations about what we as a family would do to protect ourselves should we, again, encounter people who started to spew that type of hatred towards us. My children, as I mentioned, again, are half Asian, half white, and phenotypically, they could, in essence, I suppose, quote unquote, pass as being not Asian, especially if they were with my wife. But I know that if somebody were to see my own two children with me, they would absolutely, I think, put kind of 2 and 2 together. And one of the decisions that I've made, even in my own neighborhood, is to make sure at most times that I keep my own face covered for fear that, again, somebody walking by or somebody running by or something along those lines would, again, say something or roll down their car window and scream something. And of course, I personally, you know, being ready to be able to handle something like that, but, you know, making sure that my 5 and 9-year-old, of course, weren't exposed to that type of language or that type of, again, hate. There are many, many other things that have happened that have kept me personally up at night, that have, again, me worrying about how to make sure that I can keep our family and our home safe. And thankfully, you know, I think that as a state, we have done most of the right things, and it does look like our kind of trend has flattened. But I do hope, especially as the governor starts to open things back up, and as he's often said, turns the spigot a little bit more open, that we obviously don't see a huge uptick in COVID-19 cases, again, across our state. So that's just a little bit about my own personal experience and our families as well. We wanted to make sure that we answered, again, as many questions that many of you have posed. And so we started to distribute them amongst our panelists. And so, I'm actually going to ask you to just start us off here, please. There's a question that came in earlier in the event that we'd love for you to please answer, and I'll put you up here and then I'll ask you the question. So the question, again, that came in earlier was, just prior to Vermont's stay-at-home order going into effect, the participant's daughter had overheard both xenophobic and racist comments from a couple of her fellow middle school classmates. How would you suggest schools handle racist and xenophobic fallout as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. And thank you, Paul, and thank you to the listeners and the individual that asked that question. And I want to also say that I think Tabitha has done an excellent job of sort of talking about how to be in a good bystander when you're seeing this stuff happen. And I'm going to tie my answer back to some of the things that we heard Judge Waples mention too about hate speech and freedom of speech and so forth. So let me just say that a lot of things may not necessarily rise to the level of a hate crime, but we don't have to worry about that as community members. When we see something in our community that is not aligned with who we are and our principles, that we also have the freedom of speech to speak out against that. And in many ways, and I'm not talking about criminalizing anyone or finding anyone here. We're talking about the kind of pressure that a community put on individuals that engage in discrimination, and that we are able to do that. We can do that in our schools, and we can do that in cities, and we do that in our stores. We can do work. That speech is regulated all of the time. We can regulate speech at work. People don't have the right to talk about whatever they want. For example, if someone wanted to share something at work about a sexual experience, well, that may not necessarily rise. That's not a crime. It doesn't rise to the level of sexual harassment just yet by that one statement, but a supervisor, a manager has absolutely the authority to say, not here. We have a code of ethics at work. And the same is true about schools. We have a code of ethics at schools too. And our principals and our teachers and every staff member of a school has the responsibility to uphold that code of ethics. So when we hear discriminatory speech, any kind of hate speech, any kind of bias incident, even if it may not rise to a criminal act or even a violation of our civil rights, we have an obligation to speak out and speak up against it. So how do we do that? Well, we can teach our kids to do it correctly too. So a really easy way is to say, I don't like that, right? That's very easy. Your kids who hear that can go, hey, I don't like that, don't do that. And also as parents, when we hear that, we have an obligation to approach our schools and say, my daughter came home, shared this, I was really disturbed by it, and I want to make sure that the school is addressing it. And addressing it could mean opening up an investigation about it, and addressing it could also mean maybe we need to think and talk more about discrimination at our schools. Maybe we need to do a rally. Maybe we need to learn, do more books where we're seeing more diversity in our books. Maybe we need to learn more about different groups of people. So there are many ways to address that. But before any school can take that on, we have to report it. And we have an obligation to report it if we want our community to change. So I hope that answers the question. I want to thank you for asking that, and also just say again that there is power in being a community and standing up against hate speech.
Thank you so much, Bor. We're going to move to Judge Waples. There are a couple of questions that came in earlier that we think that should be best suited to answer here for us. So I'll bring Judge Waples up. Welcome back, Judge Waples.
All right, Paul.
The first question is a little bit of a long one, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this particular case, but I'll try to break this up. With the Michelle Carter case that took place in Massachusetts, which was the case where a teenager was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter by texting her suicidal boyfriend to encourage him to kill himself, and he did in fact kill himself by suicide, does that create a new precedent where a person does not need to be physically present is this something that could be applied to hate crimes? For example, threatening phone calls, text messages, or letters?
So I am familiar with the Michelle Carter case. I am not familiar though with the Massachusetts law. So I wouldn't be able to comment on whether or not it creates any precedence. Certainly if there is a question of law before the Vermont courts that hasn't been answered by the Vermont Supreme Court yet. Frequently the courts, whether it's on the appellate level or the trial level, will look to other jurisdictions in terms of their analysis. So it may or may not have an impact on whoever in this jurisdiction. That I'm referring to the Michelle Carter case. So, but at this point, I don't think I could comment on any precedential value of that case here in Vermont. The second question, though, is whether, just so I understand it, Paul, the second half of the question is whether a person has to be present to convey the speech for it to be threatening under either criminal threatening or disorderly conduct. Is that the question?
I think that's what the participant was asking, was basically if that example from Massachusetts could be in some way applied to Vermont, especially in terms of its hate crimes, all of the things that would have to apply for something to be defined as a hate crime. And so they were, again, just trying to, I think, see if there was a way for that case to be applied in a different situation, again, here in Vermont.
And those were all by text messages in the Michelle Carter case. That was my memory. Everything was text messaging, that she was text messaging to her former boyfriend or a friend. I think it was I don't recall the exact details, but it was through text messaging. So certainly there is another criminal statute under the Vermont disorderly conduct statute, which is using a social media or a text or electronic communication of either a threat of violence against the person or a threat of harm to the person. Under that statute, again, in order to be racially motivated, though, or to have the racial bias impact the prosecution, the case, I would imagine, it would either be in a sentencing context as an enhancement, or if there's the physical force for the disorderly conduct statute, and I don't the language itself, the motivated, the bias language itself has to be accompanied by some sort of physical force and or physical violence. And I don't know if, I would imagine in a fact pattern that if the threats came through text messaging and the recipient of those messages did not experience any physical contact with the speaker, or then I don't think that would be prosecuted as, or it's up to the state's attorney to decide how they want to prosecute it. But I don't know. I think it would be difficult to uphold that as a crime under the disorderly conduct statutes.
So this next question actually ties into that, and I think you've answered this, but we just want to make sure that we ask it. The question was, can hate speech be prosecuted under public disorder if done in public? And I think this meant under disorderly conduct if done in public. Yes.
Well, let me, again, it can certainly be charged and prosecuted, I would imagine, by the state's attorney's office. But again, it's not the speech itself. It's not just the speech. It has to be accompanied by some sort of physical contact. It's the speech itself isn't under the disorderly conduct statute the only element. The other element is some sort of physical force that was some sort of harm that the victim experienced from the conduct of the speaker. Under criminal threatening, however, you do not need that physical contact. It is just the threatening speech is sufficient under 13 VSA section 1702 as an element of the offense. So that's the distinction. Disorderly conduct, which is, public. How is it phrased again in the question?
Just hate speech be prosecuted under public disorder.
Right.
Was how the question was framed.
And I would imagine public disorder, they are probably referring to disorderly conduct.
Right.
So again, so the distinction is the hate speech. If it's under the disorderly conduct statute, another element has to be some sort of physical force, physical contact that accompanies the hate speech. Under criminal threatening, the contact is not an element of the offense. It's the criminal. It's the speech is the type of speech is the conduct that is criminalized.
Okay, thank
Does that
you
make
so
sense?
much.
That distinction? Okay.
I think so. I think that there are, again, some nuances to the law that.
And again, these cases are so fact-driven. They're very, very fact-driven. So what I mean is, like, for example, one case where the physical force, there's a disorderly conduct case, and of course I can't recall the name of it now. But it wasn't appealed to the Supreme Court. It was only on the trial level. But in that case, the defendant made homophobic slurs at the victim, who was accompanied by who was with his friend, and the two of them were walking together. And the defendant then pushed the victim, yelling the slurs, knocking his glasses off. And in that case, the state's attorney charged a crime under the disorderly conduct statute. And in the trial level, the defendant moved to dismiss the case because, again, the lack of a physical harm or some sort of physical force. But the judge in that case found that the knocking of the glasses was sufficient. He did not have to suffer pain. That alone was sufficient to satisfy the element of the offense so that the defendant could be prosecuted under the disorderly conduct charge.
All right, thank you so much, Judge Wayfield. Right. Yes, we really appreciate your expertise and glad to have somebody like you on the bench who's able to understand these things at, again, the level that you are. So thank you.
Thank you.
Paul, can I follow up on that? This is Bor.
I can hear you, Bor.
Thank you. One of the only thing that I would add to that is there are people whose jobs are to look at those statutes and read them and interpret them and decide if they have been violated. And I just want to stress that as community members, we just want to report it. And we want to, so I do think that, the nuances is there, but that's typically the job of the lawyers and the prosecutors and the judges to determine that. For us, when we are seeing these things happen in our community, our job is to report it, and we can report it to the officials involved. We can report it to law enforcement if we're comfortable. We can report it to the Attorney General's office of the Civil Rights Unit. We can report it directly to the Human Rights Commission so that we are in a position to tell you whether or not the law has been violated. We can probably suggestions to do next. And I think that's the best thing, rather than people trying to determine something triggers, is to allow the people whose jobs are to figure that out for you and to help you. And I also want to mention quickly that we are trying our all data related to any sort of form of discrimination in Vermont. And even if you're not there, we want to hear about it. We have, please go to our website and have a very easy page where you can report all information to us. We want to be able to collect it only as good as all of you to work. And so please do so. Thank you for allowing me to follow up on that.
And the other thing I wanted to also add, in addition to what Boris suggested as other agencies that you can make a report to, the U.S. Attorney's Office also has in the District of Vermont, also has a civil rights division or a civil rights unit and a anti-bias unit. So you certainly can make reports there too, I understand.
Great, thank you so much. So we're going to bring it back over to Susanna here. There are a few questions that have come in that we wanted to ask her to please help us answer if she can. I'm going to change the order just a little bit. There was a question that just came in around, have there been any identifiable far-right white nationalist groups like Patriot Front or others that have been active in Vermont during this kind of crisis, and in particular pertaining to COVID-19 at all?
So the information that I have is that while we do know of extremist groups and race-based hate groups in Vermont, generally speaking, none of the incidents that I have been made aware of that relate to COVID-19 have been linked to any of those groups. That's not to say that they're not active on the topic of COVID-19, but in Vermont so far, I have not seen any hate-based activity related to COVID-19 that's linked to those groups.
Well, I suppose that's a good thing in that case. The other question that we also wanted to ask you was just, are there any plans, are there any plans to provide free COVID-19 testing in Vermont because of the intersectionality of classism and racism? A disproportionate number of people of color, especially folks without insurance, seem to be having a really hard time to afford the approximately $300 of getting a test.
Yes, so the most recent guidance from the state, and I think we can share the link to the governor's most recent announcement on the expansion of testing in the state, which is dated April 29, which feels like 3 months ago now. But the guidance that the state is giving folks is that if you're sick and you think that you may have COVID-19, you should call your provider to be evaluated and tested. If you don't have a provider, call 211, and then you're going to be referred to a clinic in your area. It's advised that you don't go to a testing site without a referral. And then at that point, also healthcare providers in Vermont are being encouraged to order a test for any child or any adult who's showing symptoms of COVID-19. If you meet the medical requirements for testing for COVID-19, you can be tested at no cost. So anyone who meets the medical requirements for COVID-19 testing can be tested at no cost. Recently, the governor expanded testing and contact tracing, and there's a detailed announcement of that on the governor's press release site.
Okay, thank you so much, Susanna, for answering those questions for us. I'm going to actually send it back to myself here to answer this next question that came in earlier. That is, the question was, were any panelists aware of whether Vermont business owners of color have been able to access the Payment Protection Program loans? Nationally, it appears that people of color have an increased likelihood of being denied loans by some mainstream banks. I can only speak for one kind of concrete example. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a part owner of a small business, and we were able to successfully access one of the Payment Protection Program loans. There was quite a bit of back and forth that we went through with a number of different financial institutions and with our own accountant, but we were able to successfully access at least that first, not the initially kind of first wave, but more recently, the second wave of stimulus funds. That's obviously a small sample size of one, I don't have data across the state that looks at whether, again, businesses that are owned by people of color have or have not been able to access those particular loans. So
Paul,
I think that,
add something there?
Yes, absolutely.
I also wanted to flag for folks that the state has created a new task force called the Economic Mitigation and Recovery Task Force. It is housed in the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and its purpose is to help Vermont come out of COVID-19 with a particular eye towards the economy and community development. And the task force has 3 subgroups, each with a distinct focus. I sit on the executive team of the task force and also on one of the subgroups. That subgroup, called the Local and Community Solutions Action Team, is tasked with interacting directly with organizations and business owners around the state to understand what are they experiencing, what are their needs and their challenges, what are they going to need in order to restart and to come back online. And it is our focus, well, one of the focuses that we have taken is to make sure that we're interacting with folks equitably. That means making sure that we're doing enough outreach to the MWBE space, minority and women-owned business enterprises. It means that we're making sure to reach out to faith leaders, folks who advocate for marginalized populations, and organizations that are owned by people in marginalized populations. The link, I'm gonna send the link for distribution to the attendees in a moment. But folks should also be aware that these are issues, PPP and other economic related issues are being actively considered by the state with respect to COVID, and we are not letting them forget about the impact on Vermonters of color.
Suzanne, I'm going to keep you up here for a moment. This question that just came in and a question that was asked earlier, you may be able to answer, but there might be another panelist that could answer this a little bit better. But the question earlier was, the inclusion of immigration status might cause issues of access for people who might be concerned that their status would be disclosed. How can immigration status be collected while avoiding these issues?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one because of a lot of things. Number one, we talked already about historical trust and the way that things like immigration status, race, and ethnicity are often used against people by government, right? So part of this is the trust building aspect. Part of it is we always want data wherever we can get it, especially when we're talking about public health. So sometimes we ask ourselves, well, why do we want the data? And in this case, it's because we want all the data, right? We want to know how this is affecting populations every way that we can slice them. However, in this case, there is a real legal vulnerability that folks may have depending on immigration status. So I don't have a firm answer, and this is not an official answer from the state of Vermont. However, I do think that because most of the demographic data is collected at the provider level, I don't think that that's necessarily the best time to collect immigration information. However, once a person tests positive for COVID-19, the Vermont State Health Department does additional outreach to that person. So every patient who tests positive gets a call from the health department, and they get follow-up interaction with the health department. That may be a good place to collect that information, because I trust it more in the hands of the state. I think that we can collect it a little bit more uniformly if it's just one centralized place that's collecting it. And I think that the state is in a good position then to be able to analyze that information and keep it safe, right? This came up in other contexts nationally. I'm thinking about when different states started offering driver licenses and driver privileges to undocumented folks. And the big concern in 2016 was, is the federal government now going to use these lists that we've aggregated to hunt people down for immigration purposes, right? So I do think that being able to safeguard that information is paramount. And again, that requires a lot of trust building. It requires a good chain of command and data stewardship. But ultimately, it is important to be able to track immigration status. However, I think how we do it is key, and perhaps it has to happen at that later stage when VDH is reaching out to patients, as opposed to a blanket collection on the front end. That's a personal opinion. That's not advice from the state.
Thank you, Susanna. We have one last question that's just come in. And again, if you can answer it, great. If not, perhaps another panelist can. But the question was, are there any plans of developing additional mental health support for first-line workers, such as healthcare employees, first responders, educators, and so on?
I don't have a real answer, but I did hear something about this that was mildly comical, which was that there are a lot of recommendations for expanded mental health services for parents who have had to deal with their children all day, every day now. So that's actually something that we're starting to consider is us being around our loved ones and needing space to recover from that as well.
As the parent of two young ones, I don't think that that's outrageous at all. And I'm sure people who are on the call who, again, might be parents as well, might understand that intimately. So what we're going to do at the moment is we're just going to ask our panelists if they have any closing thoughts that they'd like to share. If panelists, you might be able to keep those to about a minute or two at the most. Susanna, since you're up, if it's okay, we'll just start with you, and then we'll go to our other panelists to start to wrap up today's event.
Yes, absolutely. So big thanks to all of you, to the attendees, to you, Paul, Amanda, Boer, Judge Waples, Tabitha, for setting this up and for having me here. It's been educational for me as well, and I've enjoyed our time together. I suppose that in closing, I would just say that we've heard a lot of really good information here tonight. And having information for the sake of having information is important, but it's equally, if not more important, that we do something with it. So to those of you who are in policymaking or who are with community-based organizations, please do take the liberty to reach out to us with follow-up. Let us know what you're hearing on the ground from community members. Tell us if we're going down the right path, or if we're missing some consideration in as we move forward from COVID-19. The other thing I would say is that, you know, we talk about my focus, my job title is racial equity, but truth be told, I mean, this cuts across so many different groups. So there are a lot of people who think that these issues aren't relevant to them, but they really, really are, especially when we talk about intersectionality. So I would encourage us always to keep reminding our fellow Vermonters that even if they don't think these issues touch them, they absolutely do. Because when you lose that local Chinese restaurant, or you lose the only Mexican restaurant in your county, or you don't have a culture and arts center for your children to attend because it shut down, or because they couldn't get access to PPP funding or what have you, these are big losses. So just keeping in mind that we're all part of the fabric of what makes Vermont, and as such, it's our responsibility to take care of each other.
Wise words. Thank you so much, Susanna. Judge Waples, I'm going to bring it over to you next.
Well, I just think Susanna was so eloquent that I don't think there's much more I can add to that. What I would emphasize, though, is what Boer said before, and that is the reporting. Don't, you know, I'm trained as an attorney by profession. I preside as a judge, and I hope I do my job impartially and neutrally and with fairness to all who appear before me. But from my perspective was probably far more technical than, and not to say that people, I hope people could understand what I was saying when I was discussing the relevant statutes. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is to make the report. Don't get mired into whether or not it qualifies, what you experienced or what you saw qualifies as a crime or not. If, as Boer said, if it does not feel right, then you have to make the report to the appropriate person. And we are fortunate to have the Human Rights Commission here. We're very fortunate to have Susanna. I was excited to be appointed to Governor Scott's Racial Equity Advisory Panel when the executive branch created that panel. and thrilled when Susanna agreed to take the job as the executive director. So Susanna, you're probably another person that folks could also reach out to if they feel that they have been treated differently because of race or ethnicity or any of these specified biases that are recognized by law. And I would encourage folks to do that.
Thank you so much, Judge Waples. We really appreciate, again, you and your wisdom as well. Tabitha, we'll try to turn it over to you here and see if there's anything that you'd like to say to close out.
Yeah, well, I certainly echo the sentiments of my fellow panelists. I'd also add that in times of crisis, it's really easy for us to turn inward and to become suspicious of the other, especially if you're worried for your physical safety. I would encourage folks to continue to try to be curious, to try to extend to community, because that's really how we're going to get through this. The government can only support us so much. At some point, it's got to be community oriented, and we're seeing that with a lot of mutual aid organizations and neighborhood organizations stepping up and making masks and doing things for each other to protect each other. In that regard, I hope people continue that. Every crisis is also an opportunity, and we have some really great opportunities here to shift how we are inclusive of all people and mindful about those in our community that maybe we don't think about very often. So please continue to do that, folks, and feel free to reach out to the NAACP as well anytime. We're happy to help with whatever we can.
And I certainly meant to also include the NAACP in my comments. So Tabitha, I'm so sorry because we're not seeing you on screen here. So it's,
I know,
but it's such a, we've got great organizations in Vermont, and it's important to reach out to all of them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tabitha. We're going to actually send it over to Amanda here, who has an announcement that she'd like to make. Amanda, I believe your microphone.
Hi, I just want to remind everybody that we do have that incident report on our website, and also stay tuned because we're going to be doing a round of more town halls. In a couple of weeks, we'll send that one that we are partnering with the Peace and Justice Center to bring more community organizations. So please stay tuned with the Human Rights Commission Town Hall series, and Board can speak a little more about the incident report.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. Like Amanda has mentioned, we are trying to collect all sort of incidents so that we have that information to share that with our legislators and our governor and the Attorney General's office, and to the people that we know are in these positions of power who make decisions about the state of bias and incidents in our state. I want to also just quickly say that there are many reasons why we report things, and it isn't just for policy purposes or data. We report things because sometimes it can stop the discrimination from happening to you before it ever becomes an actual case or lawsuit or anything like that. Sometimes just reporting things in your school or at a hospital, or reporting things at your job actually alerts to people who work there that, hey, oh, there's a problem here, there's an issue here, and then they are much quicker than to address things. And so can actually stop the discrimination from occurring to you if you report it. And you have the right to exist in a discrimination-free environment. But when you report things, you also potentially stop the discrimination from happening to other people as well. Because oftentimes what we find is that one person might be bold enough to report something that other people have experienced. This is especially true of harassment. We often find that when someone has been harassed, that there are other people in other protected categories or who are similarly situated who have also experienced harassment at the hands of the same individual who has been perpetrating that harassment, and sometimes for years. And so when you report, you help other people as well. And if it matters, it sometimes means compensation. It sometimes means management will change. It sometimes means that there is training for people at your job and at your schools, and new positions and new rules that are created. And then the last thing, and the thing that we have mentioned, is that it informs our governor, our lawmakers, and our community members. The discrimination is very real, it is very prevalent, and it is problematic, and it requires action. I would guess the number one question that I get asked, and Amanda probably does too, and I imagine so does Susanna, when we're testifying, is how prevalent is this? How often are we seeing this? Or how many of these cases do you see? We do have people in positions of power who are connecting their decisions to these numbers. And so collecting the numbers actually is helpful to all of us, because then we have what it takes to move these policies that can really change the way that we're seeing things on the ground in our community. And for all of those reasons, I would encourage you to report. Now, I just want to say, as sort of a closing statement, for lack of, I'm a lawyer, so I almost hesitated to say closing statement, closing argument, is that first I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. When COVID-19 happened, technology was forced upon us, and none of us are any good at that. We have other jobs. Amanda is actually our policy person. I'm the executive director. Paul is a friend helping us today. So like none of us are IT. And we were trying our best tonight. And I want to thank everyone who hung on and was patient and really listened tonight and asked such wonderful questions. And while we talked about some really difficult stuff today, and we talked about discrimination, I also like to leave all of you with what I know to be true about Vermonters, is that we show up when it really matters. And I have seen our community show up to feed our kids. I have seen our community show up to support and love each other, and show up to a town hall tonight to talk about a very difficult topic, race and discrimination and disability and mental health. And I'm so grateful, so encouraged and moved by this community. And I know that we will get through this pandemic together, and that our civil rights will remain intact in doing that. And I turn it over to you, Paul, our wonderful moderator.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for those really passionate words. I too hope many of those same things as well. I want to take this moment to acknowledge and to thank all of the people that have participated in this town hall with us this evening. We hope that you've learned a little bit, that you've been able to connect with other people as well. As was said earlier, we do encourage you to please reach out to any one of us should you have additional questions or things that you'd like to discuss in more detail. The great thing about a state like Vermont is that we're not that far. We're probably connected in some way, so please take advantage of that fact and reach out should you again want to. I also want to take the moment to just thank all of our panelists who just shared again their thoughts, their expertise, their knowledge with us. I feel really fortunate to live in a state to have, again, such wonderful colleagues. So thank you so much to, again, our panelists. And also just to the Vermont Human Rights Commission for getting together and organizing this town hall. Thank you so much for doing the work that you do now amidst the pandemic, but also the work that you're doing day in and day out to make sure that Vermonters all across our great state stay safe and remain safe. So thank you again to everybody. Have a great night. Please be well and stay healthy.
Thank you.